What if I told you that Daniel's most incredible adventures happened after he survived the lion's den? While most people think Daniel's story ends with him walking out of that pit unharmed, the Bible actually reveals that his greatest prophetic visions, his most dangerous political situations, and his most shocking encounters with divine beings all occurred in the final chapters of his life. Today, we're diving into the untold story of what Daniel experienced after his most famous miracle. And trust me, what you're about to discover will completely change how you see this biblical hero. Though before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Say hi in the comments, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. It really makes us feel like the global community it is. Thank you for joining me today. So sit back, grab a drink, and let's dive in. The survivor's promotion, Darius and the Medo-Persian takeover. The dawn broke over Babylon differently than it had for centuries. The city that had once been Nebuchadnezzar's jewel now belonged to new masters. Daniel stood in the palace courtyard, his robes still bearing traces of dust from the lion's den. He was alive when he should have been nothing but memory. Darius the Mede had received the kingdom. Some scholars think he might have been Gubaru, a general appointed by Cyrus the Persian emperor to rule over the Babylonian territory. Others suggest he could have been another name for Cyrus himself, or perhaps Cyaxares II. Whatever his exact identity, one thing remained certain: power had shifted hands, and with it came a complete reorganization of how the empire would be governed. The Medo-Persian takeover wasn't simply about conquest. Beyond military might, it represented a fusion of two peoples who had learned to share power. Cyrus had married the daughter of the Median king, binding their dynasties together. Where Babylon had been ruled by absolute monarchs, whose word was law that could be changed on a whim, this new empire operated differently. Once a Persian king signed a decree into law, even he could not revoke it. The law became immutable, permanent as stone carved into mountain faces. Daniel found himself swept into this new order. Darius divided his realm into 120 provinces, each overseen by a satrap. Above these governors stood 3 administrators who would supervise them all and protect the king's interests. Daniel was chosen as one of these 3. At more than 80 years old, when most men would have withdrawn from public life, he was instead elevated to one of the highest positions in the known world. His excellence became obvious quickly. While the other administrators managed their duties adequately, Daniel distinguished himself through wisdom accumulated over decades of service. He had advised Nebuchadnezzar through madness. He had interpreted the writing on the wall for Belshazzar. He had survived regime change after regime change, not through political maneuvering, but through unwavering integrity and skill. Darius noticed. The king began planning to set Daniel over the entire kingdom, to make him second in command over all Medo-Persian territories in Babylon. Such favor bred resentment. The other administrators and satraps watched this foreign exile, this Hebrew who refused to compromise his faith, rise above them all. They searched for grounds to accuse him of corruption or negligence. They found nothing. Daniel conducted himself blamelessly in every governmental affair. Desperation led them to a darker strategy. They realized the only way to trap Daniel was through his devotion to his God. They knew he prayed 3 times daily, windows open toward Jerusalem, his knees bent in the posture of one who served a king greater than any earthly ruler. They exploited this faithfulness, convincing Darius to sign a decree forbidding prayer to anyone except the king himself for 30 days. The penalty would be execution in the lion's den. Daniel heard about the decree. He went home anyway. He opened his windows toward Jerusalem anyway. He knelt anyway. He prayed anyway. His enemies found him exactly where they expected. They brought charges before Darius, who realized too late he had been manipulated into condemning his most valued servant. The king spent a sleepless night after Daniel was thrown to the lions. He refused food and entertainment. At first light, he rushed to the den and called out, his voice carrying both hope and dread. Daniel answered. An angel had shut the mouths of the lions. The beasts that should have torn him apart had left him without a scratch. Darius ordered Daniel lifted from the den. Then he commanded that the accusers be thrown in along with their families. The lions overpowered them before they reached the bottom. It was a harsh justice by modern standards, but it followed ancient Persian custom where the guilt of one contaminated an entire household. More significantly, Darius issued a new decree. Throughout all his dominion, people must tremble before the God of Daniel. He acknowledged this God as living and enduring forever, whose kingdom would never be destroyed. A pagan king had been made to confess the sovereignty of Israel's God. Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius. He prospered during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. The man who should have perished in the den instead continued serving, his influence extending into yet another dynasty. The survivor had not merely survived. He had been promoted into a position from which he would witness and record visions that would shape understanding for millennia to come. The Medo-Persian Empire stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Daniel stood at its heart, an aging prophet whose faithfulness had earned him a place at the table of kings. But his greatest work was not political administration. His most important contributions were still ahead, visions that would pull back the veil on centuries yet unborn. The visions begin, unraveling the ram and the goat. 2 years before the incident with the lions, while Belshazzar still ruled Babylon and Daniel served in relative obscurity at that court, something extraordinary occurred. Daniel received a vision that transported him from the realities of Babylonian politics into a realm of symbolic creatures and cosmic conflict. He found himself in Susa, the capital that would become central to Persian power. He stood beside the Ulai Canal. Before him appeared a ram with 2 horns, both growing tall, though one rose higher than the other and came up last. The ram charged westward, northward, and southward. No creature could stand against it. It did whatever it pleased and became great. Then from the west came a male goat, moving so swiftly its feet seemed not to touch the ground. Between its eyes stood a prominent horn. The goat charged the ram with furious power, struck it, shattered both its horns, and trampled it into the earth. No one could rescue the ram from the goat's onslaught. The goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the large horn broke off. 4 conspicuous horns grew in its place, pointing toward the 4 winds of heaven. From one of these 4 emerged a small horn, which grew enormously powerful. It extended its reach toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. This little horn grew until it reached toward the host of heaven. It cast down some of the host and some of the stars and trampled them. It exalted itself as high as the prince of the host, removed the daily sacrifice, and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Through transgression, an army was given over to oppose the daily sacrifice. It cast truth to the ground and prospered in everything it did. Daniel heard Holy One speaking, asking how long the vision would last, and how long would the sanctuary be trampled? How long would transgression cause desolation? The answer came, for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary would be cleansed and restored. As Daniel tried to understand what he had seen, a figure appeared with the appearance of a man. A voice called from the Ulai, commanding Gabriel to make Daniel understand the vision. Gabriel approached. Daniel fell on his face, terrified. Gabriel touched him and raised him up. The angel explained that the vision concerned the time of the end. The ram with 2 horns represented the kings of Media and Persia. The 2 horns showed how the Medes came first, establishing their kingdom, but the Persians rose afterward and grew more powerful. The ram's movements westward, northward, and southward depicted the actual expansion of the Medo-Persian Empire under rulers like Cyrus and his successors. They conquered vast territories in those directions, though they made no major advances eastward. The goat represented Greece. The prominent horn between its eyes was its first king. The vision's fulfillment would come through Alexander of Macedonia, who would sweep across the known world with unprecedented speed. His conquest of the Persian Empire took roughly 11 years, a lightning campaign that matched the goat moving without touching the ground. Alexander's brilliance as a military commander was matched only by his ambition, which knew no bounds. The breaking of the large horn referred to Alexander's untimely death at age 33. Just when his power seemed unassailable, he would be cut down. The 4 horns that replaced it represented the division of his empire among his generals. His kingdom would fracture into 4 weaker realms. Macedonia and Greece under Cassander, Asia Minor under Lysimachus, Egypt and Palestine under Ptolemy, and Syria with territories extending to India under Seleucus. The small horn that grew from one of these divisions pointed toward a figure who would arise from the Seleucid kingdom. This ruler would become great toward the south, east, and the beautiful land, terms indicating military campaigns against Egypt, eastern territories, and Judea. He would exalt himself arrogantly, even against the prince of the host. He would take away the daily sacrifice and cast down the sanctuary. Gabriel was describing events that would take place centuries in the future. The little horn primarily pointed toward Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid king who would rule from 175 to 164 BC. His persecution of the Jewish people would be severe. He would outlaw Jewish religious practices, desecrate the temple in Jerusalem by sacrificing pigs on the altar, and set up an idol of Zeus in the sanctuary. His actions would spark the Maccabean revolt. The 2,300 evenings and mornings referred to the period of this desecration, roughly 6 years and 4 months from 171 to 164 BC. At the end of that time, Judah Maccabee and his brothers would reclaim the temple and rededicate it, an event still celebrated in the festival of Hanukkah. Yet Gabriel also indicated the vision reached beyond Antiochus. It pertained to the time of the end, suggesting a pattern that would repeat. Just as Antiochus would rise against God's people and his sanctuary, so would others throughout history. The little horn became a type, a foreshadowing of anyone who would exalt themselves against divine authority and seek to stamp out true worship. Daniel was overwhelmed. The vision left him exhausted and ill for days. He returned to the king's business, but he remained appalled by what he had seen. Even with Gabriel's explanation, much remained mysterious. He understood the kingdoms represented by the ram and goat, but the full implications of the little horn and its ultimate fulfillment escaped him. The vision of chapter 8 marked a transition in Daniel's prophetic ministry. Where earlier revelations had come through dreams he interpreted for kings, now he received direct visions for his own people. These prophecies were not primarily for Gentile rulers, but for the covenant community, preparing them for centuries of oppression, yet assuring them of eventual vindication. Daniel had glimpsed empires that would rise and fall long after his death. He had seen the outline of conflicts that would ravage the land his ancestors had known. He had been shown that powerful men would arise who would think they could overthrow even heaven itself. And he had been assured that such arrogance would ultimately fail, that the sanctuary would be cleansed, that truth would prevail over those who sought to cast it to the ground. The visions had begun. More would follow. Each would pull back more of the veil, revealing not just political transitions, but spiritual realities underlying all earthly power. Daniel was being trained to see with prophetic eyes, to understand that kingdoms visible to human sight were moved by forces invisible, that history unfolded according to divine decree, even when it seemed chaotic and cruel. The prayer of a prophet, Daniel's 70 weeks and a plea for Jerusalem. The first year of Darius the Mede brought Daniel to his scrolls. He had been studying the writings of Jeremiah, the prophet who had ministered during the final years of Judah's independence. In Jeremiah's words, he found a promise that gripped his heart. The desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. Then God would visit his people and fulfill his promise to bring them back. Daniel counted the years. 70 years had nearly passed since Nebuchadnezzar's first siege, when Daniel himself had been carried to Babylon as a young man. The time of exile was approaching its end. Yet Jerusalem remained in ruins, its walls broken, its temple burned. The people were scattered. Would God truly restore them? Would the promise be fulfilled? Rather than assume automatic fulfillment, Daniel turned to prayer. He set his face toward God with fasting, wearing sackcloth and ashes. What followed was one of the most profound prayers recorded in Scripture, a model of intercession that blended confession, petition, and appeal to God's character. He began by acknowledging God's greatness and faithfulness. God keeps his covenant and shows mercy to those who love him and keep his commandments. But immediately Daniel moved to confession. He did not distance himself from his people's sins. He said, "We, not they. We have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets. Daniel admitted that righteousness belonged to God alone. The shame covering their faces. The men of Judah, the residents of Jerusalem, all Israel scattered among the nations. This shame was deserved. They had been unfaithful. Yet, even in this, Daniel appealed to God's mercy and forgiveness, attributes that belong to the Lord even when his people proved rebellious. He reminded God of the exodus from Egypt, how divine power had brought the people out with a mighty hand, earning renown that lasted to that very day. Based on God's past righteous acts, Daniel pleaded for his anger and wrath to be turned away from Jerusalem, from his holy hill. Because of their sins and the iniquities of their ancestors, Jerusalem and God's people had become objects of scorn to all around them. The prayer crescendoed with urgent petition. Hear the prayers and petitions of your servant. For your sake, Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. Then came the most passionate plea of all. Lord, listen. Lord, forgive. Lord, hear and act. For your sake, my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. While Daniel was still praying, still confessing sin and making his petition, Gabriel appeared. The same angel who had explained the vision of the ram and goat now came swiftly, reaching Daniel about the time of the evening sacrifice. He touched Daniel and spoke words that would echo through centuries. I have come to give you insight and understanding. Gabriel explained that at the beginning of Daniel's prayers, a word went out. Daniel was highly esteemed. Now, Gabriel had come to help him understand the vision. What followed was the prophecy of the 70 weeks, one of the most debated passages in all of Scripture. 70 weeks are determined for your people and your holy city, Gabriel said. To finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. The word translated weeks literally means sevens. Most interpreters understand these as weeks of years, making 70 weeks equal to 490 years. This period would be divided into 3 segments, each with specific purposes and fulfillments. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That makes 69 weeks total, or 483 years. It would be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 weeks, the Anointed One would be cut off and have nothing. The people of the ruler who would come would destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end would come like a flood. War would continue until the end, and desolations had been decreed. The final week remained, a period of 7 years. He would confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week, he would put an end to sacrifice and offering. On a wing of the temple, he would set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end decreed is poured out on him. The prophecy contained layers of meaning. Scholars have debated which decree begins the timeline. Some point to Cyrus allowing the temple rebuilding in 538 BC. Others suggest Artaxerxes' decree to Ezra in 458 BC. Still others favor Artaxerxes' authorization to Nehemiah in 445 BC to rebuild the walls. Different starting points lead to different conclusions about fulfillment, though many interpreters see connections to Jesus' ministry when counting forward 69 weeks of years from various decrees. The Anointed One being cut off has been understood by many to point toward the crucifixion. Messiah would be executed, appearing to have nothing, seeming to fail in his mission. Yet interpretations suggest this cutting off would accomplish the purposes Gabriel had listed, finishing transgression, ending sin, making atonement, bringing everlasting righteousness. The destruction of the city and sanctuary was fulfilled in 70 AD when Roman legions under Titus razed Jerusalem and burned the temple. The people of the ruler who will come proved to be Rome, though the ruler himself, the one who would later confirm a covenant and set up the abomination, points beyond that historical event toward future fulfillment. The final week, the 70th seven, remains among the most debated passages in Scripture. Various interpretations exist. Some see it fulfilled in Jesus' ministry and the years immediately following. Others believe it remains future, a final 7-year period of tribulation before the end of the age. The reference to covenant making and the abomination of desolation echoes Jesus' own words in the Olivet Discourse, suggesting the prophecy may have layers of fulfillment across history. Daniel's prayer had been answered in ways beyond what he requested. He had asked for the restoration of Jerusalem and the temple. God revealed not just the return from exile, but a timeline stretching through the coming of Messiah and beyond. The 70 years of Jeremiah's prophecy would be followed by 70 weeks of years, a much longer period of divine working. The prophecy connected Daniel's present to the distant future. It assured that God had not abandoned his purposes for Israel and Jerusalem. Though desolation would continue, though the Anointed One would be cut off, though the city would be destroyed again, God was working toward ultimate fulfillment. Transgression would be finished, everlasting righteousness would be brought in, the promises would be kept. Daniel had prayed as an intercessor, identifying with his people's guilt while appealing to God's mercy. His humility and persistence moved heaven. The answer came not through political maneuvering or human effort, but through prophetic revelation, showing that restoration would unfold according to divine timeline, not human impatience. The angelic encounter, Gabriel and the cosmic battle. The third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, brought Daniel to the banks of the great Tigris River. He had been mourning for 3 weeks. No rich food passed his lips. No meat or wine touched his mouth. He used no lotions. For 21 days he devoted himself to seeking understanding through fasting and prayer. The reason for his mourning was a revelation he had received at the beginning of this period. A message had been disclosed to him, and it was true, concerning a great conflict. He understood the message and had insight into the vision. But understanding brought burden rather than relief. The weight of what was coming pressed on his spirit, driving him to this extended period of intercession. On the 24th day of the first month, as Daniel stood on the riverbank, he looked up and saw a man dressed in linen. His waist was wrapped with a belt of pure gold from Uphaz. His body resembled topaz. His face flashed like lightning. His eyes blazed like torches. His arms and legs gleamed like polished bronze. His voice sounded like the roar of a multitude. Daniel alone saw the vision. The men with him did not see it, but such terror fell on them that they fled and hid. Daniel was left alone, gazing at this great vision. His strength drained away. His face turned deathly pale. He became helpless. He heard the man speak. The sound overwhelmed him. Daniel fell into a deep sleep, his face to the ground. Then a hand touched him and set him trembling on his hands and knees. The messenger spoke, "Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I am about to speak to you. Stand up, for I have been sent to you." Daniel stood, trembling. The messenger continued, "Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, because I was detained there with the king of Persia." The words revealed a stunning reality. Daniel's prayers had been heard immediately, on the very first day of his seeking. But the answer had been delayed not by divine reluctance, but by spiritual warfare. The messenger, whom many identify as Gabriel, based on his previous appearances to Daniel, had been opposed by the prince of the Persian kingdom. Not a human ruler, but a spiritual being, an angelic power associated with Persia. For 3 weeks, this conflict had raged in the unseen realm. The messenger had been prevented from reaching Daniel until Michael arrived to assist. Michael was identified as one of the chief princes, a title indicating rank among angels. Later, he would be called your prince, the one who protects Daniel's people. This passage pulled back the curtain on cosmic reality. Behind earthly kingdoms stood spiritual powers, angels assigned to or associated with nations. These beings engaged in conflict that affected earthly events. When kingdoms warred, spiritual battles preceded and accompanied the physical conflicts. Human history unfolded on 2 levels simultaneously, visible and invisible. The messenger explained he had come to help Daniel understand what would happen to his people in the future. The vision concerned a time yet to come. As the angel spoke, Daniel bowed with his face toward the ground and became speechless. Then one who looked like a man touched Daniel's lips, restoring his ability to speak. Daniel addressed the messenger, "My Lord, because of the vision I am in anguish and am helpless. How can I, your servant, talk with you? My Lord, my strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe." The messenger touched him again, strengthening him. "Do not be afraid," he said, "you who are highly esteemed, peace. Be strong now, be strong." Daniel felt his strength return. "Speak, my Lord, since you have given me strength." The messenger asked if Daniel knew why he had come, then revealed he would return to fight against the prince of Persia. When he left, the prince of Greece would come. The succession of empires seen in earlier visions corresponded to spiritual realities. Different angelic powers were associated with different kingdoms, engaging in conflicts that transcended human understanding. Before returning to that battle, the messenger would tell Daniel what was written in the Book of Truth. This phrase suggested a heavenly record, a divine plan written before earthly events unfolded. What would happen was not random but decreed, recorded in heaven before manifesting on earth. Only Michael supported the messenger in these conflicts against the princes of Persia and Greece. Michael stood as defender of Israel, the one who contended for God's covenant people, while other angelic powers aligned with other nations. This encounter expanded Daniel's understanding dramatically. His earlier visions had shown him empires rising and falling, but now he glimpsed the spiritual mechanics behind those transitions. Prayer mattered intensely because it connected to these cosmic conflicts. His 21 days of mourning had corresponded exactly to the period of angelic warfare. His persistence had not been in vain. The revelation also explained why righteous prayers sometimes seemed unanswered or delayed. The problem was not divine unwillingness or the petitioner's unworthiness. Spiritual opposition could hinder answers, requiring sustained intercession to break through. Persistence in prayer aligned the petitioner with angelic assistance, strengthening the forces of light against the forces that opposed God's purposes. Michael's role proved crucial. He was unique among angels as the specific defender of Israel. While other nations had their spiritual patrons, Michael stood for the people of the covenant. His assistance to Gabriel showed the unity of purpose among those aligned with God's plans. They worked together, supported each other, engaged collectively in the spiritual war underlying human history. The brightness and power of the messenger terrified Daniel, draining his strength. He needed repeated touches to stand, to speak, to endure the presence of this celestial being. The gap between human frailty and angelic glory was immense. Yet the messenger addressed Daniel with remarkable tenderness, calling him highly esteemed, encouraging him not to fear, imparting strength, and reassuring him of God's favor. Daniel's faithfulness across decades had earned him this privileged position. He was not merely a recipient of visions, but a participant in cosmic events through his prayers. His intercession affected outcomes in the spiritual realm. His persistence mattered. His humility opened channels of revelation. His willingness to mourn over truth positioned him to receive understanding. The encounter prepared Daniel for what would follow in chapters 11 and 12, where detailed prophecies of coming conflicts would be revealed. Before receiving those specifics, he needed to understand the spiritual context. Earthly wars between Ptolemies and Seleucids, between northern and southern kingdoms, were not merely political or territorial disputes. They played out according to patterns written in the Book of Truth, influenced by spiritual powers in conflict, part of a larger story moving toward divine resolution. The kings of the north and south, Ptolemy versus Seleucus. After the vision of the glorious messenger and the revelation of angelic warfare, the being continued speaking to Daniel, unveiling prophecies so detailed they would later cause skeptics to insist they must have been written after the events occurred. What followed was a remarkable preview of conflicts between the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt and the Seleucid kingdom of Syria, wars that would devastate the land between them, the territory of Judea. 3 more kings would arise in Persia after Cyrus, the messenger explained. The 4th would be far richer than all the others, and through his wealth he would stir everyone against the kingdom of Greece. This referred to Xerxes I, who launched a massive invasion of Greece in 480 BC, an expedition famous for battles at Thermopylae and Salamis. Then a mighty king would appear who would rule with great power and do as he pleased. This was Alexander of Macedonia, whose conquest of the Persian Empire established Greek culture across the known world. But after he arose, his kingdom would be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven. It would not go to his descendants, as nor would it have the power he exercised, because his kingdom would be uprooted and given to others. The division that followed Alexander's death in 323 BC created several successor kingdoms, but two would dominate the narrative: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt to the south, and the Seleucid dynasty in Syria to the north. Between these two powers lay Judea, destined to become a perpetual battleground as the northern and southern kingdoms fought for regional supremacy. The king of the south would become strong, but one of his commanders would become even stronger and rule a kingdom greater than his own. This described the early years after Alexander's death, when Ptolemy I established himself in Egypt, while Seleucus I, initially serving under him, eventually seized control of Babylon and territories extending far to the east, creating an empire larger than Ptolemy's. After some years, they would become allies. The daughter of the king of the south would go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she would not retain her power, and neither would his power endure. This referred to the marriage of Berenice, daughter of Ptolemy II, to Antiochus II of the Seleucid kingdom around 252 BC. The alliance aimed to end hostilities between the two kingdoms. But when Ptolemy II passed away, Antiochus II took back his former wife, Laodice. Shortly after, Antiochus II, Berenice, and their son were all executed in a palace intrigue orchestrated by Laodice, who secured the throne for her own son. One from her family line would arise to take her place, the messenger continued. He would attack the forces of the king of the north, enter his fortress, fight against them, and be victorious. He would seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he would leave the king of the north alone. Berenice's brother, Ptolemy III, launched a massive campaign of revenge known as the Third Syrian War. He invaded Seleucid territory, captured the port of Seleucia, and plundered immense wealth, including sacred images that had been taken from Egypt in earlier conflicts. His success was total. For years afterward, the Seleucids could not effectively counter Egyptian power. The son of the king of the north would prepare for war and assemble a great army. He would sweep on like a flood, advancing as far as the fortress of the king of the south. This describes Seleucus III, and then Antiochus III attempted to reclaim territory lost to Egypt. In 219 BC, Antiochus III, later known as Antiochus the Great, began a campaign to drive south, seeking to retake Judea and advance toward Egypt itself. The king of the south would march out in a rage to fight against the king of the north, who would raise a large army, but the army would be defeated. When the army was carried off, the king of the south would be filled with pride and would slaughter many thousands, yet he would not remain triumphant. In 217 BC, Ptolemy IV gathered forces and met Antiochus III at the Battle of Raphia near the Egyptian border. Despite being outnumbered, Ptolemy won decisively. Antiochus lost much of his army, yet Ptolemy failed to press his advantage, returning to a life of luxury rather than consolidating his victory. Years later, the king of the north would return with an army larger than before, and at the end of some years would advance with a huge army fully equipped. In those times, many would rise against the king of the south. Violent ones among your own people would rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. By 202 BC, after Ptolemy IV passed away, leaving a child on the throne, Antiochus III allied with Philip V of Macedon to partition Ptolemaic territories. He launched another invasion southward. Among the Jewish people, some saw this as an opportunity to rebel against Egyptian control, believing prophecies of change were being fulfilled. Their rebellion failed. The king of the north would come and build up siege ramps and capture a fortified city. The forces of the south would not stand their ground. Not even their best troops would have the strength to resist. Antiochus III besieged and captured Sidon in 201 BC, where Egyptian general Scopas had taken refuge. The Egyptian relief forces sent to break the siege were driven back. Egypt could not prevent Antiochus from establishing control over Judea and surrounding territories. The invader would do as he pleased. He would establish himself in the beautiful land with power to destroy it. This marked a turning point. Judea passed from Ptolemaic to Seleucid control in 998 BC after the Battle of Panium. Initially, Antiochus treated the Jews favorably, but the groundwork was laid for future disasters under his successors. He would set his face to come with the might of his entire kingdom and would make an alliance. He would give a daughter in marriage to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans would not succeed or help him. Antiochus gave his daughter Cleopatra first in marriage to the young Ptolemy Foth, hoping she would serve his interests. Instead, Cleopatra sided with her husband, undermining her father's schemes. The prophecies continued through several more generations, describing conflicts, assassinations, intrigues, and wars with remarkable precision. The northern and southern kingdoms would continue their deadly dance, with Judea caught perpetually in the middle. Cities would be besieged, alliances would form and dissolve, rulers would betray each other, peoples would suffer. These detailed predictions served several purposes. They demonstrated that God knew the end from the beginning, that history unfolded according to divine foreknowledge. They prepared the Jewish people for centuries of hardship, assuring them that suffering had limits, that God remained aware even when nations warred around them. They showed patterns repeating through history: power consolidated through violence, alliances made and broken, the faithful caught between competing empires. Most importantly, they set the stage for the emergence of the figure who would become the primary fulfillment of the little horn seen in earlier visions. Out of these conflicts between north and south, out of the Seleucid line would arise Antiochus IV Epiphanes, whose persecution would test the covenant people as never before. The detailed prophecies of dynastic struggles led inexorably toward his appearance, showing that even the worst persecutors did not arise by chance, but fit within the larger pattern of history moving toward divine purposes. Daniel listened to these revelations of conflicts that would unfold centuries after his death. He heard of wars and rumors of wars, of schemes and betrayals, of suffering that would come to his people in the beautiful land. The angel's words showed that the spiritual warfare revealed earlier had earthly consequences. The battles between angelic princes of nations manifested in the wars between human kingdoms. What happened in heaven shaped what occurred on earth. The abomination of desolation, Antiochus Epiphanes, and the temple's defilement. The messenger's prophecies moved inexorably toward their most troubling fulfillment. After describing the conflicts between the Ptolemies and Seleucids in intricate detail, the focus shifted to one particular ruler from the northern kingdom. His rise and actions would mark a dark chapter in Jewish history, a persecution so severe it would serve as a prototype for all future attempts to stamp out true worship. A contemptible person would arise to whom they had not given the honor of royalty. He would appear during a time of peace and would seize the kingdom through intrigue. The passage pointed toward Antiochus IV, who took the throne name Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. He was not the rightful heir. His nephew Demetrius I should have inherited the Seleucid crown. But Antiochus maneuvered his way to power in 175 BC, displacing the legitimate succession through political cunning. Then an overwhelming army would be swept away before him. Both it and a prince of the covenant would be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he would act deceitfully, and with only a few people he would rise to power. This referred to his military campaigns and his dealings with Jewish leadership. In Jerusalem, tensions had developed between traditional Jews who maintained their ancestral customs and Hellenizers who embraced Greek culture. When the high priesthood became a political appointment, rather than a hereditary position, wealthy Jews began bribing Seleucid authorities for the office. Jason, brother of the legitimate high priest Onias III, paid Antiochus for the position and promised to promote Greek customs in Jerusalem. 3 years later, Menelaus outbid Jason, purchasing the high priesthood for himself despite not even belonging to the priestly line. When Onias III protested this corruption, he was executed. The murder of a righteous high priest, the prince of the covenant, signaled the depths to which things had fallen. When Antiochus felt secure, he would invade the richest provinces and do what neither his fathers nor his forefathers had done. He would distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He would plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time. Antiochus used wealth confiscated from conquered territories and temples to buy loyalty, a practice his predecessors had not employed so systematically. His attention turned toward Egypt. With a large army, he would stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south would wage war with a large and very powerful army, but would not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him. In 169 BC, Antiochus launched an invasion of Egypt, taking advantage of the weakness of the boy king Ptolemy VI. The campaign succeeded brilliantly. Antiochus captured Ptolemy and controlled most of Egypt except Alexandria. The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, would sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end would still come at the appointed time. Antiochus pretended friendship with his captured nephew Ptolemy, but both schemed against each other. Meanwhile, Alexandria had crowned Ptolemy's younger brother as a rival king. The situation grew unstable. Antiochus would return to his own country with great wealth. On his way back from the Egyptian campaign, he stopped in Jerusalem. His heart would be set against the Holy Covenant. He would take action against it and then return to his own country. This first visit to Jerusalem in 169 BC involved plundering the temple treasury. Antiochus took golden vessels, the altar of incense, the table of showbread, and other sacred objects. He removed them without major bloodshed, but the violation of the sanctuary enraged the faithful. At the appointed time, he would invade the south again, but this time the outcome would be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands would oppose him, and he would lose heart. Then he would turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He would return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. In 168 BC, Antiochus invaded Egypt again. This time Rome intervened. A Roman envoy named Gaius Popilius Laenas met Antiochus outside Alexandria. When Antiochus said he would consider Rome's demands, Laenas drew a circle in the sand around him and commanded he decide before stepping out of the circle. Humiliated, Antiochus agreed to withdraw from Egypt. Furious and embarrassed, Antiochus marched back toward his territories. Rumors had reached him of unrest in Jerusalem, where Jason had attempted to reclaim the high priesthood from Menelaus. Antiochus interpreted this as rebellion against his authority. He would take out his rage on the Jews who remained faithful to their covenant. His armed forces would rise up to desecrate the temple fortress. They would abolish the daily sacrifice and set up the abomination that causes desolation. In December 67 BC, Antiochus sent his general Apollonius with an army to Jerusalem. On a Sabbath, when Jews would not fight, the troops attacked. They demolished the city walls. They built a fortress called the Acra overlooking the temple, garrisoning it with soldiers and Hellenized Jews who enforced Antiochus's decrees. The persecution that followed was systematic and brutal. Antiochus outlawed the practice of Judaism. Observing the Sabbath became a capital offense. Circumcising children brought execution for the entire family. Possessing Torah scrolls meant imprisonment or worse. Jews were forced to sacrifice to Greek gods and eat food forbidden by their laws. On the 25th of Kislev, 167 BC, the ultimate desecration occurred. An altar to Zeus Olympius was erected in the temple. Pigs, animals considered unclean by Jewish law, were sacrificed on the altar. The sanctuary became defiled in the most offensive way imaginable. This was the abomination that causes desolation, the culmination of Antiochus's war against Jewish faith. Small shrines to Greek gods appeared throughout Judea. Jews were compelled to participate in pagan festivals, to eat pork, to violate every distinctive mark of their covenant relationship with God. Officials traveled from town to town enforcing compliance. Those who refused faced torture designed to break them. Scourging, dismemberment, being roasted alive. Martyrdom stories from this period testify to the courage of those who chose death over apostasy. With flattery, he would corrupt those who violated the covenant, but the people who knew their God would firmly resist him. This was the crucial division. Some Jews cooperated with the persecution, whether from fear or from genuine embrace of Hellenistic culture. But others, those who knew their God, stood firm. They refused to compromise, even when facing horrific consequences. The prophecy Daniel received centuries earlier had prepared the faithful for exactly this moment. When persecution came, they could understand it within the framework of divine revelation. Antiochus was the little horn that had grown great. He was the contemptible person who seized power through intrigue. He was the one who exalted himself against the prince of the host. His actions fulfilled what had been foretold. This fulfillment served multiple purposes. It vindicated the prophecy, showing that God had known centuries in advance what would occur. It encouraged the faithful by demonstrating that suffering had limits set by divine decree. The 2,300 evenings and mornings would end. The sanctuary would be cleansed. And critically, it established a pattern. The abomination of desolation was not a one-time event, but a recurring reality. Antiochus was the first fulfillment, but Jesus would later warn his disciples to watch for another abomination in the same location. The pattern revealed in Daniel pointed toward multiple manifestations across history. Antiochus Epiphanes represents the archetypal persecutor, the ruler who believes he can stamp out faith through violence and coercion. He underestimated the resilience of those whose identity was anchored in something deeper than cultural practice or political convenience. The faithful knew their God. That knowledge sustained them through torture, strengthened them in the face of threats, and enabled them to choose fidelity over survival. The defilement of the temple struck at the heart of Jewish worship. The sanctuary was where heaven and earth met, where God's presence dwelt among his people. To defile it was to attack the very possibility of relationship between the divine and human. Antiochus sought to replace the worship of the invisible God with the worship of idols, to substitute covenant faithfulness with cultural assimilation. But his apparent victory would prove temporary. The abomination would last the prophesied time, then the sanctuary would be reclaimed. The daily sacrifice would be restored. True worship would resume. Antiochus could desecrate the physical building, but he could not destroy the living faith of those who stood firm. Their resistance, often unto death, testified to a reality beyond his power to corrupt or control. The wise and the righteous, resistance in the face of persecution. The prophecy continued beyond Antiochus's desecration of the temple, focusing on those who would respond to the persecution. Those who are wise would instruct many, though for a time they would fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered. When they fell, they would receive a little help, and many who were not sincere would join them. This passage pointed toward a group known as the Masculine, the wise teachers. During the persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes, these faithful instructors refused to abandon their teaching ministry. They continued explaining Torah, maintaining Jewish practices, and encouraging others to stand firm. Their wisdom was not primarily intellectual, but practical. They understood what faithfulness required in times of crisis. The Masculine bore remarkable similarity to Daniel himself. Just as he had remained faithful during Babylonian and Persian rule, refusing to defile himself with royal food or to cease praying despite royal decree, these teachers carried forward his legacy of costly faithfulness. They valued covenant relationship with God above physical safety. When persecution intensified, many of these teachers fell. Some faced execution by sword. Others were burned, a method used to terrorize communities into compliance. Still others were imprisoned or had their property confiscated. The prophecy acknowledged this suffering honestly. Being wise did not grant exemption from consequence. Standing firm often meant accepting martyrdom. Yet their suffering served a purpose. Some of the wise would stumble so that they might be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. The persecution functioned as a crucible, separating genuine faith from superficial commitment. Those whose allegiance was shallow would abandon their heritage under pressure. Those whose faith ran deep would endure, their character refined through suffering like gold tested by fire. The phrase, "a little help," likely referred to the Maccabean revolt that would arise in response to the persecution. In the village of Modin, when Seleucid officers arrived to enforce pagan sacrifice, an aged priest named Mattathias refused. When another Jew stepped forward to comply, Mattathias struck him down along with the royal official. His act of defiance sparked a guerrilla war. Mattathias and his 5 sons fled to the hills, calling all who were zealous for the law and the covenant to join them. What began as a small band of fugitives grew into a formidable resistance movement. After Mattathias passed away, his son Judah, known as Judah the Maccabee or Judah the Hammer, led the forces with brilliant tactical skill. The Maccabees fought not just for political independence, but for the right to practice their faith. Their campaigns against Seleucid forces were remarkably successful. Within 3 years, they had retaken Jerusalem except for the Acra fortress. In December 164 BC, exactly 3 years after the abomination was set up, Judah and his followers cleansed the temple, rebuilt the altar, and rededicated the sanctuary. The celebration of that rededication would become the festival of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, still observed to this day. The miracle associated with it, oil for one day lasting 8, symbolized divine intervention, sustaining the faithful beyond natural capacity. Yet the prophecy's description of this help as little proved accurate. The Maccabean victory brought only temporary relief. The Hasmonean dynasty that emerged from the Maccabean line would itself become corrupt, eventually inviting Roman intervention. The political freedom gained through military resistance did not resolve the deeper spiritual issues. Many who joined the Maccabees did so for nationalistic rather than religious reasons, fulfilling the prediction that insincere people would attach themselves to the movement. The Maskilim were not primarily focused on military resistance. Their warfare was of a different kind. They fought to preserve Torah knowledge, to maintain Jewish distinctiveness, to ensure that faith would survive even if the nation did not. They taught when teaching was forbidden. They circumcised when circumcision brought execution. They observed Sabbath when doing so risked capture. Stories from this period, preserved in texts like Vern and Sekou Maccabees, testify to their courage. An aged scribe named Eleazar was forced to eat pork. He could have pretended to comply while actually eating something else, but he refused, saying his deception might cause others to stumble. He accepted torture and execution rather than provide a false example. 7 brothers and their mother were executed one by one, each refusing to violate Torah even as they watched the others suffer. The mother encouraged each son to remain faithful, choosing to lose them all rather than see them apostatize. These martyrs became models for later generations. When Christians faced Roman persecution, they looked back to the Maccabean martyrs as examples of faith stronger than fear of execution. The pattern established in Antiochus's persecution repeated. Empires attempt to enforce conformity through violence, while the faithful accept suffering rather than compromise. The Maskilim also preserved texts. During times when possessing scripture brought danger, scribes carefully copied and hid manuscripts. They memorized vast portions of Torah so that even if physical texts were destroyed, the word would survive in living memory. Their work ensured that when the temple was rededicated, the scrolls needed for proper worship were available. These wise teachers understood that genuine victory was not primarily military or political. True triumph meant maintaining covenant faithfulness, regardless of circumstances. A nation could lose its independence, yet remain spiritually intact if it preserved its relationship with God. But if that relationship was abandoned, military victory would prove hollow. The prophecy indicated refining process would continue until the time of the end. The persecution under Antiochus would conclude, but the pattern would repeat. Throughout history, pressure would come on those who maintained faithfulness. Each generation would face its own tests, its own Antiochus figures, its own choice between compromise and costly obedience. The Maskilim set the template for faithful response. Teach truth regardless of consequences, maintain practices that mark covenant identity, accept suffering rather than deny faith, and trust that God's purposes extend beyond immediate circumstances. Their wisdom was not about avoiding hardship, but about enduring it with integrity intact. Their influence extended far beyond their own time. When Jesus spoke of those who would be hated for his name's sake, who would face persecution yet should stand firm, he echoed the experience of these teachers. When Paul wrote about being refined through suffering, producing perseverance and character and hope, he drew on the same understanding the Maskilim embodied. Daniel's vision prepared the faithful for this era, knowing in advance that persecution would come, that a contemptible ruler would defile the sanctuary, that standing firm would cost some their lives. This knowledge equipped them to interpret their suffering within a framework of divine sovereignty rather than meaningless chaos. They were not victims of random cruelty, but participants in a cosmic drama where faithfulness mattered more than survival. The time of the end, eschatology and the resurrection hope. The angelic messenger's prophecies shifted from the persecution under Antiochus to something beyond, something further in time and greater in scope. At the time of the end, the king would do as he pleased. He would exalt and magnify himself above every god and say unheard of things against the God of gods. He would be successful until the time of wrath was completed, for what had been determined must take place. The language here moved from historical fulfillment to eschatological expectation. While Antiochus Epiphanes provided the initial pattern, the full realization of these prophecies pointed toward a future figure who would exceed even Antiochus in arrogance and opposition to divine authority. This shift from historical to future fulfillment characterized much of Daniel's prophecy, where near events foreshadowed distant ones. The messenger described this future ruler with characteristics that transcended Antiochus. He would show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the one desired by women, nor would he regard any god but exalt himself above them all. Instead of these, he would honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his ancestors, with gold and silver, precious stones, and costly gifts. The reference to fortresses suggested military power elevated to ultimate importance. This ruler would worship strength itself, trusting in weaponry and military might rather than any traditional deity. His self-exaltation would reach unprecedented levels, claiming for himself honors belonging only to God. At the time of the end, the king of the south would engage him in battle, and the king of the north would storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He would invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. The pattern of conflicts between northern and southern powers would continue, but now with this arrogant king at the center. He would also invade the beautiful land. Many countries would fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon would be delivered from his hand. He would extend his power over many countries, and Egypt would not escape. He would gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Cushites in submission. But reports from the east and the north would alarm him, and he would set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He would pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he would come to his end, and no one would help him. The prophecy described military campaigns and conquests, but ended with sudden termination. This ruler, despite his power and pride, would meet an appointed end. His destruction would come not from human opposition, but from divine intervention. No one would help him because his fate was sealed by decree. Then the messenger spoke words that revolutionized Jewish understanding. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. This was the Great Tribulation, a period of suffering exceeding all previous hardships. The scope suggested more than Antiochus's persecution, more than any historical calamity. It pointed toward a final crisis, a climactic conflict between good and evil, between divine purposes and human rebellion. But deliverance would come, not for everyone, but for those whose names were written in the book. The image suggested divine foreknowledge and election, a heavenly record of those who belong to God. Michael would arise as defender, standing for the covenant people in their hour of greatest need. Then came the statement that marked a watershed in biblical revelation. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. This was the first clear Old Testament declaration of bodily resurrection for both righteous and wicked. Earlier passages had hinted at life beyond death. Job had spoken of seeing his Redeemer even after his skin was destroyed. Isaiah had written of the earth giving birth to her dead. But here Daniel received explicit revelation that death was not the end, that the graves would open, that judgment would extend beyond earthly existence. The resurrection would not be universal salvation. Some would awake to everlasting life, vindication and reward for faithfulness maintained through suffering. Others would rise to shame and everlasting contempt, facing consequences for their rejection of truth. The distinction was absolute and eternal. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. The Maskilim, the wise teachers who had instructed many and stood firm through persecution, would receive glory exceeding earthly comprehension. Their faithfulness, which had seemed to end in defeat as they fell by sword and flame, would be vindicated in resurrection. The image of shining like stars connected to ancient understanding that stars were heavenly beings, angels. The wise would be elevated to something approaching angelic glory, their transformed bodies radiating divine light. Their reward would not merely be continued existence, but glorification, transformation into beings of splendor. This resurrection hope transformed how the faithful understood suffering. Martyrdom was no longer tragedy without remedy. Those who lost their lives for faithfulness would receive them back in glorified form. The persecutors who seemed victorious would face judgment. Justice would be accomplished, if not in this age, then in the one to come. The messenger then commanded Daniel, "But you close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge." This sealing was not about hiding the prophecy, but about preserving it for the proper time. When the events began unfolding, those who studied Daniel's visions would recognize the patterns and understand their significance. The increase of knowledge could refer to people searching the scriptures, trying to understand the prophecies. It might also point toward general increase in human knowledge as history progressed toward its consummation. Either way, the sealed scroll would remain relevant, its meanings becoming clearer as history unfolded. Daniel saw two others standing on opposite banks of the river. One asked the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters, how long it would be before these astonishing things were fulfilled. And the man raised both hands toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. When the power of the holy people had been finally broken, all these things would be completed. The time period of 3.5 years echoed earlier references to the length of persecution. It suggested a definite period, limited by divine decree, though seemingly endless to those enduring it. The breaking of the power of the holy people described the complete shattering of human self-reliance, the point where only divine intervention could bring salvation. Daniel heard but did not understand. He asked what the outcome of all this would be. The messenger replied that the words were closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Many would be purified, made spotless, and refined, but the wicked would continue to be wicked. None of the wicked would understand, but those who were wise would understand. This was a sobering declaration. Not everyone would comprehend the prophecies. Wickedness carried with it a blindness to spiritual truth. But the wise, the same term used for the faithful teachers, would understand. Their purity of heart would enable them to perceive what others missed. From the time that the daily sacrifice was abolished and the abomination that causes desolation was set up, there would be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. These specific time periods added detail to the 3.5-year time frame. The slight variations suggested either different ways of measuring the same period or additional time required for complete restoration after the persecution ended. Those who endured to these appointed times would be blessed, receiving the vindication and restoration God promised. The final words to Daniel were personal and tender. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. Daniel himself would experience the resurrection he had been shown. He would rest in death, then rise to receive his reward. This promise assured Daniel that his long service, his decades of faithfulness through multiple empires, his careful preservation of these visions would not end in oblivion. He would participate in the resurrection of the righteous, receiving an inheritance prepared for him. His place was secure among those whose names were written in the book. The sealed scroll, the hidden meaning of the prophecies. Daniel received the command to seal up the words of the scroll until the time of the end. This sealing created a paradox. The prophecies were written down, preserved, available for reading, yet their full significance remained hidden, waiting for proper fulfillment to illuminate their meaning. The scroll was simultaneously accessible and concealed. Throughout Israel's history, this tension defined how Daniel's visions were understood. The text was read in synagogues, studied by scribes, pondered by the faithful, but layers of meaning remained elusive. Even Gabriel's explanations left mysteries. Daniel himself confessed he heard but did not understand. If the prophet who received the visions could not fully grasp them, how much more difficult for later readers? The sealing served multiple purposes. First, it authenticated the prophecies. A sealed document could not be altered. When events began matching Daniel's visions, readers could verify they were reading the original revelation, not something modified after the fact. The seal proved the prophecy preceded its fulfillment. Second, the sealing protected the message during times of persecution. When Antiochus Epiphanes outlawed Jewish texts, when Romans later destroyed the temple and scattered the people, when various powers throughout history attempted to eliminate Scripture, Daniel's prophecies survived. They were sealed not with wax, but with divine protection, preserved through catastrophes that destroyed countless other writings. Third, the sealing created anticipation. Knowing these visions pertained to future events motivated each generation to watch for signs of fulfillment. The sealed scroll generated ongoing engagement with the text, as readers tried to discern whether they were living in the times Daniel described. During the intertestamental period, the centuries between the last Old Testament writings and the New Testament, Daniel's prophecies profoundly influenced Jewish thought. The Maccabean crisis gave the first major fulfillment. When Antiochus defiled the temple, when the Maskilim stood firm, when guerrilla fighters reclaimed Jerusalem, readers recognized these events from Daniel's visions. This fulfillment did two things. It validated the prophecy, demonstrating that Daniel had genuinely received revelation centuries before events occurred. But it also raised questions. Were these prophecies now completely fulfilled? Or did they point toward additional future fulfillments? The answer, which would become clear with time, was both. The community at Qumran, who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, studied Daniel intensely. Multiple copies of the book were found among their library, showing how valued these prophecies were. The Qumran community saw themselves living in the end times, believing Daniel's visions were reaching their ultimate fulfillment in their generation. They were both right and wrong. They lived in significant times as Roman power grew and messianic expectations intensified. But the full culmination lay beyond their era. The apocalyptic genre that Daniel exemplified influenced numerous other Jewish writings during this period. Books like Enoch, 4 Ezra, and Sechem Baruch adopted similar styles: symbolic visions, angelic interpreters, prophetic timelines, cosmic conflicts underlying earthly events. Daniel provided the template for this literary form, showing how to communicate divine revelation about future events and spiritual realities. The concept of resurrection, so clearly stated in Daniel 12, transformed Jewish theology. Earlier texts had suggested Sheol, the realm of the dead, as a shadowy existence from which none returned. Daniel's vision of multitudes awakening, some to everlasting life and others to shame, introduced categories that would dominate later Jewish and Christian thought about the afterlife. Different Jewish groups interpreted this resurrection differently. The Pharisees embraced it, believing the righteous dead would rise bodily at the end of the age. The Sadducees rejected it, acknowledging only the Torah and finding no clear teaching of resurrection there. The debates between these groups, recorded in the Gospels, centered partly on how to understand passages like Daniel 12. The sealed scroll also influenced how Jews understood prophecy itself. Daniel's experience showed that prophets might not fully comprehend their own visions. The meaning would become clear in fulfillment, not necessarily at reception. This created humility in interpretation while maintaining confidence that genuine revelation had occurred. The specific time periods Daniel mentioned, the 70 weeks, the times, and half a time, the 1,290 days, the 1,335 days, generated endless speculation. Readers attempted to calculate when prophecies would reach completion. Most of these calculations proved wrong, but the exercise kept people engaged with the text, watching for fulfillment. When Jesus began his ministry, Daniel's prophecies formed part of the air his audience breathed. Messianic expectations were high, shaped partly by Daniel's visions of one like a son of man, receiving an everlasting kingdom. References to the abomination of desolation, to tribulation, to angelic warfare, all these concepts were familiar to first century Jews because of Daniel. The sealed scroll was being progressively unsealed, not through human wisdom, but through divine action in history. Each fulfillment revealed another layer of meaning. Each crisis showed new dimensions of the prophecies. What seemed closed remained open to those whom God granted understanding. This patterned church history, believers have returned to Daniel during times of persecution and upheaval, finding in his visions both explanation and encouragement. When empires oppress the faithful, when rulers demand worship belonging only to God, when true practice of faith brings danger, Daniel's experiences and prophecies speak with fresh relevance. The sealed scroll paradoxically communicates most clearly during the very circumstances it describes. When readers face their own Antiochus, their own demand to compromise or die, Daniel's words cease being ancient history and become immediate reality. The prophecies were sealed until the time they were needed, then opened to those experiencing what Daniel foresaw. This explains why each generation discovers new depths in these visions. The prophecies contain nested fulfillments, patterns repeating at different scales across history. Antiochus was one fulfillment, but not the only one. Rome would provide another. Future powers would continue the pattern. The sealed scroll addresses not just one moment, but the recurring structure of how evil powers oppose divine purposes until their appointed end. The preservation of Daniel's book through so many crises testifies to divine faithfulness. The text survived Babylonian captivity, Persian rule, Greek persecution, Roman destruction, medieval anti-Jewish violence, and modern skepticism. The sealed scroll remained sealed, yet readable, hidden, yet accessible, mysterious, yet illuminating. Daniel's final days, legacy of an aging prophet in a foreign land. The book of Daniel ends with the promise that Daniel would rest and rise again at the end of days, but it tells us little about how his final years unfolded. The third year of Cyrus marked his last recorded vision. Beyond that, Scripture remains silent about Daniel's remaining time, yet we can trace the probable contours of those years through what history and the text reveal. Daniel was in his 80s during the reign of Cyrus. He had served Babylonian kings for nearly 70 years, then continued under Darius and Cyrus. His experience was unmatched. Few men lived so long, fewer still maintained influence across such dramatic political transitions. His reputation extended beyond court circles into the wider Jewish community. Under Cyrus, a remarkable decree was issued allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. For the Jews, this meant permission to return to Judea and reconstruct the temple in Jerusalem. Some traditions hold that Daniel may have influenced this decision by showing Cyrus the prophecies of Isaiah, which named Cyrus by name before he was born and predicted he would order Jerusalem rebuilt. Whether Daniel personally presented these texts remains unknown, but the decree itself aligned remarkably with these ancient prophecies. Whatever Daniel's role in the decree, its impact changed everything for the Jewish exiles. The 70 years of captivity Jeremiah prophesied were complete. The people could go home. Many did. Under Zerubbabel's leadership, nearly 50,000 returned to Judea in the first wave. They carried vessels from the original temples preserved through Babylon's conquest, now being returned for the new sanctuary. Daniel did not return with them. At his age, the difficult journey would have been nearly impossible. More importantly, his position at the Persian court likely seemed providentially ordained. Having a righteous, influential Jewish administrator at the center of imperial power benefited his people more than one more elderly man in Jerusalem. His influence manifested in various ways. The favorable treatment Jews received under Cyrus and his successors likely reflected Daniel's counsel. The resources provided for temple reconstruction, the protection offered to returning exiles, the general Persian policy of religious tolerance, all these aligned with principles Daniel could have advocated. He may have mentored younger Jewish officials, training them to serve with integrity in foreign courts. Ezra, who later led another wave of returnees and carried authority directly from the Persian king, might have learned from Daniel's example, if not his direct instruction. Nehemiah, who served as cupbearer to Artaxerxes and later as governor of Judea, followed patterns Daniel established, serving foreign kings faithfully while maintaining covenant loyalty, using political to benefit God's people. Daniel's later years likely included quiet scholarship. He had received so many visions, witnessed such dramatic events. The command to seal up the scroll until the time of the end suggested he was to write down and preserve what he had been shown. This work of recording and organizing his prophecies would have occupied significant time. He may have compiled the Aramaic sections of his book during this period, the chapters written in the language of imperial administration that spanned much of the known world. These sections addressed Gentile rulers and kingdoms, showing God's sovereignty over all nations. The Hebrew sections addressed his own people specifically, preserving prophecies in their sacred language. Prayer continued defining his life. The pattern established long ago, 3 times daily, windows open toward Jerusalem, kneeling in devotion, surely persisted. Even after surviving the lion's den, even with no legal requirement or personal danger, he maintained the discipline. It was not fear that drove his prayer life, but love. Not duty, but delight. He likely remained in Babylon, that great city on the Euphrates where he had spent nearly his entire adult life. The Hebrew colony there had grown substantial, a community that would persist for centuries, producing the Babylonian Talmud much later. Daniel was perhaps its most distinguished member, a link between the old kingdom and the new reality. His death, when it came, passed without biblical record. No dramatic deathbed scene was preserved. No final prophecy was recorded. The book ends with the promise of his resurrection, jumping from the command to go his way until the end, directly to the assurance he would rise. The years between were left unstated. Jewish tradition suggests he was buried in Susa, the Persian capital where his vision of the ram and goat had been set. Whether this is accurate cannot be confirmed, but it carries symbolic weight. The man who served foreign kings while maintaining faithfulness to his God, who saw visions of empires rising and falling while awaiting a kingdom that would never fall, would rest in a Persian city until resurrection morning. His legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. The book bearing his name became central to Jewish identity during subsequent crises. When Antiochus persecuted them, they had Daniel's prophecies showing this had been foreseen. When Rome destroyed the temple again, Daniel's visions provided framework for understanding. Throughout medieval persecutions during modern catastrophes, Jews returned to Daniel's example of maintaining identity under pressure. For Christians, Daniel became a prototype of faithful witness in hostile culture. Early believers facing Roman persecution looked to his courage. Medieval monks studied his apocalyptic visions. Reformers found in his prophecies support for their understanding of church history. Modern believers facing pressure to compromise see in Daniel's life a model of graceful resistance. He demonstrated that exile need not mean abandonment by God, that serving secular authorities need not require abandoning divine authority, that one could navigate complex political realities with both wisdom and integrity. His life showed that faithfulness sometimes leads to promotion rather than persecution, though it must remain faithful even when persecution comes. The prophet who interpreted dreams taught that God reveals mysteries. The administrator who served multiple empires showed that competence and character transcend political systems. The man thrown to lions but protected by angels testified that divine power exceeds earthly threats. The elder who received visions of the end demonstrated that God's purposes stretch beyond any single lifetime. Daniel rested with the promise ringing in his ears. At the end of days, he would rise to receive his inheritance. He who had lived through Babylon's fall and Persia's rise, who had seen visions of Greece and Rome and kingdoms yet to come, would witness the final kingdom personally. The faithful administrator would receive commendation from the ultimate king. The aging prophet would wake to glory. The apocalyptic blueprint, Daniel's influence on Jesus and Revelation. When Jesus stood before his disciples on the Mount of Olives, delivering his discourse about the end times, he reached back to Daniel. When you see standing in the holy place the abomination of desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, he said, let the reader understand. In that moment, Jesus validated Daniel's prophecies as genuinely predictive, genuinely authoritative, and genuinely unfinished. The reference was unmistakable. Daniel had recorded Gabriel's words about an abomination that causes desolation, a desecration of the sanctuary by powers opposed to God. Antiochus Epiphanes had fulfilled this in the 2nd century BC. But Jesus spoke of another fulfillment yet to come. The pattern Daniel revealed would repeat. Another defiler would arise. Another crisis would test the faithful. Jesus' use of Daniel went deeper than this single reference. Throughout his ministry, he consistently referred to himself as the Son of Man, a title drawn directly from Daniel's visions. In chapter 7, Daniel saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, approaching the Ancient of Days and receiving authority, glory, and sovereign power. This Son of Man would be given an everlasting dominion that would never pass away, a kingdom that would never be destroyed. When Jesus used this title, he was making a claim. He was identifying himself as the figure Daniel saw, the one to whom all authority would be given. When the high priest asked if he was the Messiah, Jesus answered by combining Daniel's Son of Man with the Psalms. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The reference was so clear, so obviously claiming divine status, that the high priest tore his robes and accused him of blasphemy. The Olivet Discourse, Jesus' teaching about the end times, recorded in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, extensively paralleled Daniel's prophecies. Wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, famines and earthquakes, persecution of the faithful, false messiahs and false prophets, the need for endurance, the sudden coming of the Son of Man. All these themes echoed Daniel's visions. Jesus warned that when they saw the abomination of desolation, those in Judea should flee to the mountains. The urgency was extreme. Don't go back to get a cloak. Pray your flight doesn't happen in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there would be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. The language mirrored Daniel's description of a time of distress such as had not happened from the beginning of nations. Within a generation, Jerusalem fell again. Roman legions besieged the city in 70 AD. Titus ordered the temple destroyed. The daily sacrifice ended not because of desecration, but because the altar no longer stood. Jesus' prophecy proved accurate. Those who fled to the mountains survived. Those who remained faced catastrophe. The Roman eagles, standards carrying images worshipped by soldiers, stood in the holy place, another abomination echoing Antiochus's actions and pointing toward future fulfillments. The book of Revelation drew even more extensively from Daniel. John's visions on Patmos were saturated with Danielic imagery, structure, and themes. The apocalyptic genre Daniel pioneered reached its fullest biblical expression in Revelation, which presented itself explicitly as prophecy, as unveiling of hidden realities, as revelation of things that must soon take place. Revelation's 4 living creatures around the throne combined features of the 4 beasts Daniel saw. One like a lion, one like an ox, one like a man, one like an eagle. Where Daniel saw these as successive empires, John saw them as constant attendants on divine glory, suggesting all earthly kingdoms ultimately serve the throne. The beasts rising from the sea in Revelation 13 paralleled Daniel's vision of the 4th beast with its horns. The dragon gave the beast his power, throne, and great authority. One of the heads seemed to have a fatal wound that had been healed. The whole world followed the beast in amazement. People worshipped the dragon and the beast, asking who could wage war against them. This beast was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth would worship it, everyone whose name had not been written in the Lamb's book of life. The parallel to Daniel's little horn and final persecuting ruler was unmistakable. A second beast rose from the earth, exercising all the authority of the first beast. It performed great signs, even making fire come down from heaven. It deceived inhabitants of earth, ordering them to set up an image in honor of the beast. It was given power to give breath to the image so it could speak and cause all who refused to worship it to be taken away. This echoed the demand for worship that Daniel and his friends had faced, now on a global scale. The time periods Daniel mentioned appeared in Revelation transformed. The 1,260 days became 42 months, became a time, times, and half a time. The 3.5-year period of persecution and tribulation reappeared. still representing a definite period set by divine decree, still bounded though seemingly endless to those enduring it. Revelation's emphasis on patience and faithfulness echoed Daniel's masculum. Here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commands of God and remain faithful to Jesus. Those who endure to the end will be saved. The saints must be patient and faithful, even if it means captivity or death. Victory comes through remaining faithful unto death, not through avoiding martyrdom. The resurrection hope Daniel received became central to Revelation's conclusion. John saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. The sea gave up its dead. Death and Hades gave up their dead. The prophecy of multitudes awakening, some to everlasting life and others to shame, found its full expression in the final judgment scene. The New Jerusalem descending from heaven fulfilled Daniel's promise of an everlasting kingdom. The nations would walk by its light. Kings would bring their glory into it. Nothing impure would enter it, only those whose names were written in the Lamb's book of life. The promise that the saints of the Most High would receive the kingdom and possess it forever reached its culmination. Jesus' second coming explicitly connected to Daniel. He would return on the clouds, visible to every eye, just as Daniel saw the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. The kingdoms of this world would become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he would reign forever and ever. The rock not cut by human hands would crush the statue and become a mountain filling the earth. The New Testament writers consistently treated Daniel as predictive prophecy pointing toward Jesus and the end times. They did not view his visions as merely historical records of past events or symbolic representations of timeless truths. They understood them as genuine revelation of future realities, progressively fulfilled across history, reaching ultimate completion in Jesus' first and second comings. This interpretive approach validated Daniel's authority while expanding understanding of his prophecies. The Son of Man was Jesus. The kingdom given to the saints was the church and its future glorification. The resurrection of the dead would occur at Jesus' return. The abomination of desolation had multiple fulfillments across history. The little horn and final beast represented a pattern recurring through various rulers and culminating in a final Antichrist. Paul's letters referenced Daniel's themes. The man of lawlessness who exalts himself over everything called God, sitting in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God, echoed Daniel's descriptions of rulers opposing divine authority. The mystery of lawlessness already at work, restrained until the proper time, reflected Daniel's vision of conflicts delayed by angelic intervention until appointed fulfillment. The writer of Hebrews pointed to Daniel's experience among the martyrs of faith. Some faced jeers and flogging, imprisonment, and stoning. Others were sawn in two or put to the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They were all commended for their faith, yet none received what had been promised, since God had planned something better, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Daniel stood among that cloud of witnesses, having received the promise of resurrection, yet waiting with all the faithful dead for the appointed time. His visions assured that the wait had purpose, that history moved toward divine consummation, that suffering was temporary while glory would be eternal. The apocalyptic blueprint Daniel received shaped how believers across 2 millennia understood their place in history. They lived between the first and second comings, between the kingdom inaugurated and the kingdom consummated, between the defeat of evil at the cross and its final destruction at the end. Daniel's visions provided categories for comprehending this in-between time, this age of mission and suffering, of gospel advance and persecution, of faithfulness rewarded with tribulation yet promised ultimate triumph. The unfinished prophecy, Daniel's enduring mystery in the modern world. 2.5 millennia after Daniel received his visions, believers still ponder his prophecies, study guides, analyze the 70 weeks. Commentaries debate the identities of the beasts. Preachers draw contemporary applications. The sealed scroll remains both accessible and mysterious. Its patterns recognized, yet its ultimate fulfillment still anticipated. This enduring relevance speaks to the nature of Daniel's prophecies. They were not merely predictions of specific events, but revelations of recurring patterns. The same dynamics that played out in ancient empires continue manifesting in modern powers. Rulers still demand what belongs only to God. States still persecute those who maintain covenant faithfulness. Pressure to compromise still tests whether allegiance truly runs deep or merely serves convenience. Consider how Daniel's experiences resonate today. Professional believers face environments where faith must be private, where religious expression in workplace settings draws censure, where promotion sometimes requires compromising convictions. Daniel's example of maintaining prayer habits despite professional risk speaks directly to such situations. Entire communities face pressure to abandon distinctive practices, to assimilate into dominant culture, to exchange their heritage for acceptance. The choice between remaining recognizably faithful and gaining social approval repeats the dilemma Daniel's friends faced before the statue. The masculine who taught Torah when teaching was forbidden mirror contemporary believers in restricted nations who meet secretly to study Scripture. The abomination of desolation, repeatedly fulfilled yet still awaited in its final form, reminds readers that opposition to true worship takes many forms across history. Antiochus desecrated the physical temple. Rome destroyed it. Throughout church history, various powers have opposed genuine Christian worship, demanding false allegiance or enforcing spiritual compromise. Where is the line between rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's and rendering to God what is God's? When does cooperation with secular authority become collaboration with evil? Daniel navigated this tension by serving competently in administrative roles while refusing any act that compromised his worship of the one true God. He bowed to no one but God, literally. His dietary restrictions maintained identity boundaries. His prayer habits demonstrated primary allegiance. Modern believers face analogous decisions, though contexts differ. Medical professionals confront requirements that conflict with conscience. Business owners navigate regulations that impact religious practice. Citizens decide how to respond when laws oppose biblical convictions. Daniel's life doesn't provide specific answers for every situation, but it models the process. Maintain integrity, serve excellently, refuse ultimate compromise, accept consequences, and trust divine deliverance, whether in this life or the next. The apocalyptic elements of Daniel's visions continue generating discussion. Are we living in the time of the end? Does current political alignment match prophetic patterns? The temptation to identify contemporary figures as the Antichrist or current events as the final tribulation has recurred throughout church history, usually inaccurately. Yet the prophetic expectation itself remains valid. There will be a final fulfillment. The patterns will culminate. The Son of Man will return on the clouds. The challenge is discernment. How do we take prophecy seriously without becoming presumptuous about timing? Daniel's own experience offers guidance. He received visions he didn't fully understand. He was commanded to seal them until the time of the end. When he asked for more clarity, he was told to go his way, that the words were sealed until fulfillment revealed their meaning. This suggests humility in interpretation, coupled with confidence that genuine revelation had been given. The resurrection hope Daniel received transformed how subsequent believers understood death. The promise that the wise would shine like stars, that those who led many to righteousness would receive everlasting glory, that names written in the book would be delivered. These assurances enabled countless martyrs to face execution with courage. When this life was not the only life, when death was not the end, when faithfulness would be vindicated beyond the grave, suffering gained meaning it could not otherwise possess. This hope remains central to Christian faith. Paul wrote that if the dead are not raised, believers are to be pitied above all people, for their faith is futile. But Christ has been raised, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Just as death came through a man, resurrection comes through a man. In Christ all will be made alive, each in proper order. Christ the first fruits, then at his coming those who belong to him. The pattern Daniel glimpsed has been confirmed in Jesus and awaits completion at his return. The cosmic conflict Daniel witnessed between Michael and the princes of Persia and Greece reminds believers that earthly events connect to spiritual realities. The apostles would later write about wrestling not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The powers and authorities, the rulers of the darkness of this age, These unseen forces shape events in ways usually invisible to human perception. This understanding prevents simplistic analyses of history and current events. Nations don't act merely from political calculation or economic interest. Spiritual dynamics underlie human decisions. Prayer matters not just psychologically, but cosmically, connecting human intercession to angelic assistance. Persistence in prayer demonstrates alignment with divine purposes against opposing forces. Yet Daniel also revealed that these conflicts operate according to appointed times. What is written in the book of truth will occur. The end will come when decreed. This provides both warning and comfort. Warning that opposition will continue until the appointed end, comfort that the end is indeed appointed, that chaos does not reign, that history moves toward divine resolution regardless of how chaotic it appears. The wise who shine like stars represent an invitation extended to every generation. Wisdom in Daniel's context meant covenant faithfulness maintained through pressure. It meant instructing others in truth despite cost. It meant refining through suffering that produced endurance and character. The same invitation stands today. Be among the wise, maintain faithfulness, instruct others, endure suffering, and receive the promised glory. The unfinished nature of Daniel's prophecy keeps believers vigilant. Each generation watches for fulfillment, ready for the Son of Man to appear, prepared for tribulation yet expecting deliverance. This expectancy has characterized faithful believers for 2,000 years. It will characterize them until the hope is realized. The prophecies remain relevant because the patterns remain active. Empires still rise and fall, rulers still exalt themselves above the divine. The faithful still face pressure and persecution. Witnesses still teach truth despite opposition. The resurrection remains the sure hope beyond suffering and death. The kingdom that will never be destroyed continues advancing, stone cut without hands, growing into a mountain that fills the earth. Daniel's life and visions invite each generation into the same posture he maintained: faithful service in the present age while awaiting the age to come, competent engagement with earthly kingdoms while ultimately serving the kingdom of heaven, maintaining distinctive identity without compromise while contributing meaningfully to the societies in which providence places us, accepting that full understanding may remain sealed until fulfillment reveals meaning, and trusting that names written in the book will be delivered when Michael stands up for his people. The aged prophet who rested with the promise of resurrection provided more than predictions about distant events. He modeled how to live between the times, how to maintain faithfulness across decades and regime changes, how to serve excellently without compromising conviction, how to persevere through visions that disturbed more than comforted, and how to rest in the assurance that divine purposes would prevail despite all earthly opposition. His legacy endures because the story he glimpsed continues unfolding. Each generation finds itself somewhere in the narrative he recorded. The beasts still prowl, the little horns still arise, the saints still suffer pressure, but the Ancient of Days still sits enthroned, the Son of Man still approaches to receive his kingdom. The resurrection morning still draws nearer, and those who remain faithful still await the fulfillment of the promise. At the end of days, you will rise to receive your inheritance.